Has anybody ever heard of this guy? His name is Rupertus Milledinius. Rupertus Milledinius. Any hands? Anybody ever heard of him? Well, don't feel bad. Until this week, I hadn't either. Rupertus was a Lutheran theologian in the 16th century. And the reason that I was Googling him and finding out information about him is he is apparently the source of one of my favorite religious sayings, and a saying that was one most associated with the Restoration movement in Churches of Christ. And that is, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity, which in the 16th century meant love. I have always loved that statement because that's the way the relationships in a church should be. Freedom in the non-essentials, unity in the essentials, and then in everything we do, even when we have to have some minor disagreements here and there over the essentials or the non-essentials, in everything there must always be love. So I think Rupertus was inspired actually to say this. Our love, as Jesus said and as the apostles said, is really what defines us as the followers of Jesus. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, all 13 verses are about one subject. You remember I've told you the last couple of weeks that the dividing point in this book comes at 1 Corinthians 7. The first 6 chapters, Paul is addressing the church at Corinth about things that he is concerned about relating to them and their doctrine. And then beginning in chapter 7 and through the remainder of the book, Paul is answering questions from them. Questions that they have sent to him by letter that were hand-delivered. And so in chapter 7 last 2 weeks, we looked at questions sent to him about marriage, about separating from an unbeliever, about being single, all sorts of issues relating to marriage in the first century there, church at Corinth. And now, in chapter 8, the entire chapter is going to be about a subject that sounds really goofy to us today, but was really important to them, and I'll tell you why in just a few minutes, and that is the subject of eating meat sacrificed to idols. So actually in verse 1, he's going to say, now concerning the question you have about meat being sacrificed to idols, here's what I have to say, and the whole chapter is about that. So he is going to be addressing with them a question they have about whether something is essential or non-essential. So I want to start today a little different than I have ever done a lesson in here. And I'm going to ask you a series of 3 questions, and I'm going to just ask you to answer out loud, and I'm going to ask nobody to boo or hiss anybody else's answer, okay? It's just answer out loud, throw out loud the answers to these questions. Because, and so I'll go ahead and give them all 3 to you in advance. Given this statement, in essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty or freedom; in all things, love. I want to address all 3 questions. And the first question is going to be this: what are some things that are always wrong? The second question is going to be, what are some things that are always right for Christians to do? And the final question is going to be, what are some things that may seem wrong to some Christians and not seem wrong to others? Because that is exactly the issue that's going to be going on here in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 with eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols, and the church was split on it. Christians can split on all of these areas having to do with what's essential, what's non-essential, what's kind of in the middle that we better compromise out of love with. So let's start with the easy one. What are some things that are always wrong? Sin, right? Lying's always wrong. All right, what else? Stealing is always wrong. It's one of the 10 Commandments, too. We've got lying, stealing, and sin in general. Boy, we got to get a little more than that now. There's some things that are always wrong, yes? What? Coveting, good, all right. Adultery, all right, good. Worshipping idols of any kind, good. What are some things that are always wrong? Kevin? Taking the Lord's name in vain, yep. What are some things that are always wrong? Denying Christ, yes. What? Putting someone down. Okay, yet. I'm sorry? Backbiting. All right? Probably could add a handful more, don't you think? All right, always wrong, never right. What are some things that are always right for Christians to do, Lewis? Oh, you're still on the other one, okay. Okay, all right. Love your brother. Sharing your faith is always right, yes. What's up? What? Giving grace to others, yes, yes. Thanking God, spirit of thankfulness, yes, very good, yes. Praying for others. Mm-hmm. What are some things that are always good? Yes, AC? Yep. Yep, giving. What are some things that are, what? Studying God's Word. Yep. Taking care of widows and orphans, a direct command of the Bible, yes. Being honest. And what? And loving. Yes. Anybody else? Some things that are always right. Paying your debts. Forgiveness. Yes. All of the fruit of the Spirit, practicing all in. They're in a cluster, so we should have them all at the same time, but any of them individually. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, meekness, temperance, self-control. Any of those, always right, yes? Singing, yes. Okay? Honor your father and mother. Mm-hmm. All right, now, we probably would have fairly unanimous view on things that are always right and always wrong. Now we get to 1 Corinthians 8 and meat that has been sacrificed to idols. Careful here, no booing, no hissing. This is just your brother or sister's honest opinion. What are some things that may seem wrong to some Christians and not seem wrong to others? What? Drinking alcohol? Yeah, drinking water's fine. We're all okay with that. I'm going to use that as an illustration, by the way, in the lesson. What? Dancing, yes. Yes, so did mine, yes. It's the reason why my parents thought dancing was wrong, and they wouldn't let me go to the proms, and it's the reason today why I can't dance. I mean, don't you think I'd be a good dancer otherwise? Don't you think they inhibited me otherwise? Oh, don't answer. Kevin. Birth control. All right, that's a big issue, whether you folks realize it or not, in the Roman Catholic Church, too. They big issue. Yes? Playing cards. Abortion. Yeah. AC? Yeah, clapping your hands or any demonstrative action in worship. All right. Who else? Yes? War. The war issue is a huge one. It was, in fact, the school where I'm an alumnus, David Lipscomb, was very anti-war, did not believe that a Christian could join the military or go to service. So, all right. Any others? What? Divorce? Yeah, that's a big one. And not just divorce, but also remarriage. And when it's, okay, yes? Yep. The death penalty. The death penalty, yes. Yeah, that's a good one, actually. That's argued a lot, yes? Taking your brother or sister to court, definitely. That's going to come up in a later one, yes? What about singing during communion? Okay, yes? Immunizations. Yeah, okay? I ain't falling for that trap. I got better sense than that. All right, that's good enough. That's a good stop. But you see what I'm saying? And I could add a whole lot more on that one. Of things that are sort of in the gray area with most people. Some people think they're okay. Some people think they're not. But I think we hit most of the biggies. Areas where Christians disagree on the non-essentials. Now, the problem is some people believe they're essentials. And that's the interesting thing about this text is these lists that we just did right now in, what is today's date? July 18th, 2021. These lists that we just did in here right now, if we'd listed them on screen, would have been very different from the list in Rupertus Melodinius's day in the 16th century. For example, did you know that in the Middle Ages it was considered immoral for Christians to pay interest on a loan? Back then, that was an essential. It was something Christians just did not do. There are several proverbs that talk about how unwise that is, and a couple of references in the New Testament. And that was just something Christians didn't do. I can remember when I was first a youth minister, and a young one at that, and I had a youth parent who did not think his son should ever be in a group where there was an even number of boys and girls. In fact, he would have rather all the boys be together and all the girls be together, but certainly there shouldn't be an even number of boys and girls because he believed that encouraged coupling, which would lead to all types of sinful behavior. And I remember one Sunday night after church, we had a bus full of kids. We were going to go to get ice cream after church, and he came on the bus and counted the number, and it was equal or within 2 or 3 of each other, and he pulled his son off the bus and took him home and wouldn't let him go on the trip. And the kid was just humiliated in front of all, but he felt very strongly that that was a wrong thing to do. And as we said a couple times, my parents frowned on quite a bit of things to do, including dancing or proms or that kind of thing. So you understand the lists change through the years because over the years there have been lots of disputes over what behavior should be on the essentials list and always have been. Well, Christians in the church at Corinth were dealing with a very interesting essentials dispute. And we're going to read the text in just a moment all at one time, but before we do, I think you should have this background to our discussion. I think you should understand how thoroughly idolatry and pagan practices and sacrifices permeated every single area of Greek and Roman society. It was impossible for any Christian in Corinth to escape contact with pagan people and their practices. It went on around them all day, every day. And so these areas of concern that Paul is going to deal with in our text, something that they asked him directly for help and advice on, may sound very silly to us, but it wasn't to them. And that is the subject of eating meat. Now, sometimes people hear this and they think, well, was this a vegetarian dispute? Because that's one we have going on today. And there are even some people in church who believe that we should not be eating meat. And so was this a vegetarian dispute? No, not in any sense of the word. The problem had to do with where the people shopped for their meat. You see, there were two sources of meat in the ancient world. The regular market, where the prices were always higher, they were what we of course call market price. And the other place to get meat was in the local pagan temples. And meat was fairly cheap there because it was considered to be used meat, because this was meat that had been offered in sacrifice to pagan idols and pagan gods. Part of the carcass was consumed upon an altar as a sacrifice, but the rest of it, whatever was left, was used in different ways. The pagan priest would use some of it for their own personal food supply, and they would sell some of it as used meat to the public. So that's the issue going on here. Some of the Christians at Corinth had asked Paul, are we dealing with an essential here, or are we dealing with a non-essential here? Because people who had been in the church a long time said, look, it's perfectly fine. We have, and you're going to see this word come up in the first 2 or 3 verses. It's perfectly fine. We have knowledge about this meat. This meat was used this way, but they were offering it as sacrifices to false gods. I mean, that's not a god, a hunk of stone, a hunk of metal, a hunk of wood. It's just meat that fools have sacrificed to stone or wood or metal. So in their mind, it was an inexpensive way for people who could almost never afford meat to feed their family cheaply. Eating this meat was always on the new Christians' right list. And not eating this meat was always on the new Christians' wrong list, because the new Christians had grown up in that area and knew that this meat had been sacrificed to idols, and that these people were very serious in that practice, and they just felt like this meat was contaminated. It was not something they should eat that had previously been offered to, I think Dr. Krill, I think, is the one who said idolatry is always wrong. This meat had been offered as a sacrifice to idols, and so this is something that would always be wrong. So with that in mind, let's see what Paul advises. Understand again that this question is one of a list of questions that had been sent to him, and so he's answering them in this letter. And I can just imagine the people sitting in these churches, these small house churches, 20, 30, 40, 50 people in a house church or in an open courtyard, and they're just waiting carefully, waiting on pins and needles to see how he's going to answer, what he's going to say. And he starts out by seeming to agree with the older, mature Christians, but he doesn't end up there. Now, regarding your question about food that has been offered to idols, yes, we know that we all have knowledge about this issue, because the people who'd been Christians longer will say, we have knowledge about this. We know about this issue. We know it's meat sacrificed to idols. But while knowledge makes us feel important, It is love that strengthens the church. In another translation, I think it says, knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Anyone who claims to know all the answers doesn't really know very much. But the person who loves God is the one whom God recognizes. So what about eating meat that has been offered to idols? Well, we all know that an idol is not really a god and that there is only one God. There may be so-called gods both in heaven and on earth, and some people actually worship many gods and many lords. But for us, there is one God, the Father, by whom all things were created and for whom we live. And there is one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things were created and through whom we all live. However, not all believers know this. Some are accustomed to thinking of idols as being real, so when they eat food that has been offered to idols, they think of it as the worship of real gods. And their weak consciences are violated. It's true that we can't win God's approval by what we eat. We don't lose anything if we don't eat it, and we don't gain anything if we do. But you must be careful so that your freedom does not cause others with a weaker conscience to stumble. Now that's an interesting passage there. And let's review sort of what Paul has said here. If others see you with your superior knowledge eating in the temple of an idol, won't they be encouraged to violate their conscience by eating food that has been offered to an idol? So because of your superior knowledge, which I can just see in quotation marks there, a weak believer for whom Christ died will be destroyed. And when you sin against other believers by encouraging them to do something they believe is wrong, you are sinning against Christ. So if what I eat causes another believer to sin, I will never eat meat again as long as I live, for I don't want to cause another believer to stumble. Let's unpack that. Let's get out some spiritual steak knives here for just a minute and cut into this text. How did he answer them? Well, first, he seemed to agree with the mature believers. In the first line, he said, about food sacrificed to altars, we know that we all possess knowledge. We know what the real issue is here. So he's seeming to agree with the more mature Christians who are saying it's okay to eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols. That knowledge is correct. And so I'm sure the older Christians sort of sat up a little straighter and probably sucked in their guts and their bulging meat-filled bellies and were just a little tickled there about how he began. But then he said something that hit them where it hurts. He said, but knowledge puffs up while love builds up. And I can just imagine at that moment their stomachs pulled right back in where it was. Because the fact is, knowledge, even knowledge of the essentials, leads to conceit and pride and thinking I'm right about everything. And if our knowledge makes us into spiritual know-it-alls who don't think of others, we've missed the point entirely. We're not as smart as we think. In our pride, we are not really displaying our maturity, he says. We are displaying our immaturity. And that's why he aims at humbling the meat eaters with his reasoning. He said, yes, you have knowledge, but those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. Wow. So I pulled over and parked in my own personal study there in my office with about 5 different commentaries and 3 different screens with every version of the Bible there and every possible word that could mean. And because that was an interesting principle to me. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. And I thought about all the times that I have thought I knew something, and then I've changed my mind. Have you ever changed your mind on something, a biblical belief, a moral belief, a spiritual value? Have you ever changed your mind on something in the spiritual realm that you were fully convinced you had been right? Boy, I have. And so that's the argument Paul is trying to make to these more mature Christians, is sometimes we think we know something, but we don't know as much as we think we know, or we have not thought it through fully. So Paul is reminding them and us here that when in our prideful knowledge we fail to empathize with those who are less mature in their faith, because these were new Christians that were saying, this offends me, eating meat offered to idols, we can actually lead them into sin. Our lack of love in the non-essential list can lead others to disobey an essential. That's what he's saying. Sure, he's saying there's nothing actually wrong with eating this meat. But if by doing it you would lead a weak baby Christian back to idolatry, some of these Christians actually had practiced this sacrificing meat to idols before they became Christians. And if by doing this, you might be leading this baby Christian back to idolatry. Maybe you don't think as much, maybe you don't know as much as you think you did. Now, we don't have that issue today, but we have one that is very, very close. And that I can't remember who brought it up when we were on the list of the questionable list, but drinking alcohol was on that list. Now, drinking alcohol is always been a debatable issue because there are proverbs that make it sound like you should never do it, but there are verses in the New Testament that suggest that it is okay as long as drunkenness and lasciviousness are not involved. So it's always been one of those on that third list, questionable list for people. And there are multiple reasons why Jesus turning water into wine, wine being used in communion, blah, 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 blah. And you could go back and forth with that argument. And I've done it a million times. And I could take, if you wanted to argue it with me after church today, I could. And I'd just say, you pick your side, I'll pick the other one. And I'll take the other side. So whichever side you want. And I feel like I would beat you. That's how on the non-essential list it is. You make a real strong argument on either case. And so, but here's where you can't make an argument on that case, in my mind. Paul says here, you may be tempting these weaker Christians to go back and eat, by eating meat sacrificed to idols, you may be tempting them to go back into the practices of eating that meat and may eventually go back into idolatry. Same principle holds true with alcoholism. I would hope there's nobody in here that if you have no personal struggle with alcohol and that you don't get drunk and you practice it almost entirely privately and in your home or whatever it may be, and you don't have any problem with it, there's no drunkenness involved, and so it's not a sin to you, but you understand it's a sin to others, and particularly you have somebody over to your home for dinner who is an alcoholic, and you offer them a drink, or you have a drink yourself, because they weren't offering these weaker Christians meat, they were just eating meat in their presence. It's almost an exact parallel. It is almost an exact parallel. And see, I would say that's wrong. I would say from what I know in Scripture, it's almost a perfect parallel, and that would be wrong. If you know somebody is an alcoholic and you have them over for dinner and you casually serve alcohol, you could be leading them back into alcoholism, just like some of these mature Christians in Corinth could have been leading some of these meat eaters back into idolatry. You may have every right to do it. And Paul said that, in effect. You may have every right to do it, and yet it may still be wrong to do. Do you understand that? There are some things you have a right to do, but it can still be wrong to do it. Paul's point here is that, yes, we have rights, but we must exercise them in love. I like how author Stephen put it. The exercise of personal rights is never simply personal. I mean, your right to extend your fist stops at my nose. You have a right to extend your fist. You can swing it out here all day, as long as it didn't get within an inch or two of my nose, and then your right ends, and what was right suddenly became wrong. Similar principle to what Paul is teaching here. Our actions, right and wrong, affect others, and we need to be mature enough to remember that. Knowledge is essential, but it's not sufficient, Paul says here. It has to be used in a loving way. And that's a principle that Paul gets to later in the same letter in chapter 13 when he says, if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge and have a faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I do not act in love, I am nothing. Listen, we're free to do many things the Bible does not prohibit. But if doing them directly causes a brother to stumble, we're responsible for that. In our freedom, we must never do something that would trip someone else up, something that would keep them from Jesus or make their maturing process as a Christian more difficult. Let me give you a personal example that happened to me. It wasn't with a member here, so I think I can tell you this. I met a man who said he was a Christian for several years, and he also told me his favorite form of relaxation was smoking pot. I don't know exactly how I feel about smoking pot because that's not a regular practice of mine. So I do not know the effects of it. I don't. All I know is what I have read. Okay? So I know what I've read, and I've read a lot about it because there's been huge debates about it, and it's legal now in many states in our country. So, but I don't know from a personal level other than what I've read, the debates for and against it. But this young Christian said, I don't relax by drinking. I never drink. I don't smoke. I don't gamble, but I sometimes like to relax by smoking pot. And I don't think it does anything other than relax my body. And I said, are you comfortable doing that as a Christian? And he said, absolutely, 100%. And I said, well, what makes you comfortable doing that as a Christian? And he went back and quoted from Genesis chapter 1, where God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit seed in it, they will be yours for food, and I give you every green plant for food. And that is in Genesis 1:28 and 29. And he said, every green plant for food, cannabis is a plant that grows in the ground, just like other things we use. And I said, well, but you smoke it. You don't eat it. And he said, you want me to bring you one of my brownies? Well, I didn't have an answer prepared because I'd never been asked that question before. Well, let me rephrase that. I had an answer prepared to the direct question, no. But I didn't have an answer prepared for the rest of what the question implies, because I'd never been asked that before, and I hadn't even thought about it or thought through it. But I did then simply say to him, Paul's point is we have to look at everything we do in light of how it affects everyone else, and Paul said that we shouldn't use our freedom to cause somebody else to stumble. But at a minimum, you've got to give him points for creativity, whether you agree with him or not. So that's just one issue that could fall in again at some point down the line. I think it will. Maybe not in my lifetime, but I think within 20 to 40 years, given that what we have seen in the last 20 to 40 years, that subject will fall on the non-essentials third list, just like people today mentioned drinking and gambling and some other things. I think it's very likely it will, because it's being pushed so heavily within our country. By the way, though, in this text, Paul takes it a step further. He says if in our liberty we lead a person to sin, we have sinned against Jesus. A lack of love for others is a sin against the Lord. That's what he said. Now, how do we know we're using our freedom as Christians? How do we know we are using it rightly? I got to hurry here. I parked too long on the other stuff. There's going to be three groups I need to quickly identify here, okay? Three groups of Christians, three ways believers tend to exercise their rights and try to view these things. One are legalists. Legalists in general focus on the externals. To them, outer behaviors are vital. What people think is extremely vital. Legalists generally impose their human opinion or tradition on themselves and on everybody else. Not so bad if they just impose it on themselves. They have the freedom to do that. But on everybody else. Legalists generally love lists of do's and don'ts, especially the don'ts. Legalists don't believe in hardly any gray areas. I see some of you trying to write this down, and it would be much easier for you if you just when I get to the end of the screen, if you just took a snapshot of it with your phone. And I'll tell you when I get to the end of the screen. They also can be very critical people. I mean, I'm just giving you my experience, but I have personally found legalists to be very, very critical people. And most importantly, the longer you are in the legalist mindset and the stronger you become in it, you become more isolated from other people, including other legalists, and you become separatist because you're so concerned you might do something wrong, they decide to isolate themselves. There's the list that I have anyway. That's my list of legalists. If you want to take snapshots of it. All right. The second group I would call, and by the way, Paul really ripped this group in Titus chapter 1. There are many rebellious people who engage in useless talk and deceive others. This is especially true of those who insist on circumcision for salvation. For there are many, they must be silenced because they are turning whole families away from the truth by their false teaching. I've actually seen that happen. I have seen people be turned away and won't even visit a church because they know some of the practices of some of the people there who are such legalists, and they say there's no way I could ever possibly fit in there. Of course, there's another extreme, And that's a group, for lack of another word, we're going to call permissives. So you got legalists on one end of the string, and you got permissives on the other end of the string, and that's people who say, for anything goes. Anything goes. There's a church down the street from us, maybe 3 or 4 miles away from here, that anything goes. I don't care who you are. You can go there and feel comfortable and free. You can be a Muslim, you can be a Catholic, you can be a non-believer, you can be anything and go there. And they basically unite on nothing. And I never have quite understood that, but anything goes. No rules. No gray areas. They don't have a list of gray areas because, think about it, anything goes. They flaunt their freedom. They make fun of people who obey rules, even good rules. I've said a word or two here this week about my parents not letting me go to dances or proms, and at the time I didn't like it and I was embarrassed by it as a kid, but in reality that was the right choice back, at least in that time frame. Whether it would be the right choice today, I don't know, but it was the right choice in that time frame as I look back on it. The junior high that I went to was a pretty rugged school with a lot of bad influences, and I think they made the right choice. So people would make fun of me and made fun of them. That's okay. We weren't permissives. And selfish individualism, they don't need other people and their rules, and they tolerate indiscriminately. That is, they believe the highest goal is tolerance, which in effect is their truth. Tolerate anything and everything. Now let's get to this last group, Christian maturity, and what Paul is calling these people to. And so in most of the things I'm going to say here, I'm going to pull out principles that he mentioned directly in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Focus is more on internals, the fruit of the Spirit, than externals. A mature Christian pays more attention to the character traits of the fruit of the Spirit in their life than they do just to outward behaviors when other people are watching. Who you are when no one is looking is the best way to evaluate a Christian. Being biblically knowledgeable and mature, knowing the Bible, knowing what it says, and not taking it out of context is very, very important for a mature Christian. Restricting your own personal freedom for the sake of love. I could give many examples, but for the sake of time, we'll use the one that I mentioned earlier about you have someone to dinner and they're an alcoholic and you know it, not inviting them to have a drink. For the sake of not causing a stumbling block to someone else. And here's another thing. Spiritually mature Christians are known most for what they do, not for what they don't do. It's always bothered me since I was growing up in church. My church that I grew up in, we were known for what we didn't do. You don't smoke, you don't drink, you don't chew, and you don't go with girls who do. We were known for what we didn't do, period, all the time. We didn't cooperate with other groups. I could go on and on with the list of what we didn't do. That's what we were known for, totally. Until my teenage years, when the most explosive youth group I've ever seen developed and started inner city ministry, starting running buses down into projects with a ministry that is still going 45 years later and has baptized thousands and thousands of people. And we became suddenly known for what we did rather than what we didn't do. And so I think that's the level of Christian maturity that Paul is advocating for here in 1 Corinthians chapter 8.